That's a wonderful photo.
Been a long time since I flipped through the book, actually.
Powell Street Festival. Oh, it's so nice.
Tamio, I respected not just archival historical photographer, as an artist. I loved his photography.
You know, Tamio was in a lot of ways a person on some sort of mission that, or at least in part, had to do with self-healing and then playing some sort of role in the world that would allow that healing to take place.
Tamio must have a mission to record.
I've often been asked, how did I, a callow youth from a small farming community in southwestern Ontario, manage to become part of the most luminous moment in modern American history? Home was a small ramshackle house situated at the bottom of our town's black neighborhood. A short walk from our home sat two gospel churches with historic markers to memorialize the runaway slaves from the southern United States. Chatham was the terminus of the Underground Railroad. It was also the final destination of my Japanese-Canadian family after their internment and forced removal from our home on the West Coast. My boyhood years were a kaleidoscope of joy and pain. And Chatham was a brutal yet wondrous boot camp for the coming wars. My allies in this uneven struggle were my Nisei and black friends from the neighborhood. There was much to be grateful for, but every now and then the ugly face of racism would appear to snatch away our hard-won victories. I remember the year 1963 with clarity. I was completing what turned out to be my final year at the University of Western Ontario when I made an abrupt turn in my life's journey. Throughout that summer, I had been following the spectacle of the civil rights movement that had erupted across the southern United States. I turned on the TV to witness a compelling drama unfolding at a lunch counter in Danville, Virginia. Like the eye of a hurricane, a group of black and white students, about my age, sat calmly at the forbidden counter, while all around them raged the winds of racial violence and hatred. These students were an imminent presence that day, and in some deep but yet unnamed part of me, I understood the essence of their struggle. Later that summer, I watched the historic March on Washington.
Freedom! Freedom now!
I was swept away by the dream rhetoric of Dr. Martin Luther King. But it was the rough, uncompromising words of John Lewis, the young chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that were to remain with me. And where, I wondered, is my own rightful place in this monolithic white world? Perhaps within this Black freedom movement, I could locate the matrix of my own liberation. As the summer was coming to an end, I loaded my sleeping bag and a backpack into the Beetle, hugged my mother goodbye, and drove south.
I'm Judy Richardson. I am a filmmaker and educator, talking about the civil rights movement, lessons, and history. So it's 1963, and I've just come from Cambridge, Maryland. I had been at Swarthmore College, was taking off a semester. I thought I was going back to Cambridge, but I get stopped by Jim Foreman, the executive secretary, to become his secretary. So at that point, in November of 1963, is when I joined the staff of the National Office of SNCC, and that's where I meet Tamio. SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and we were the only youth-led, youth-founded Southern civil rights movement that was national. You know, and we were always seen as the most radical of all of them, you know, and also we were not building a movement of, you know, Black ministers and Black teachers and the Black middle class. We were building a movement that was based in those who had no voice, and to let them know, you have the voice, this is what you can do. You can be the sheriff, you can be the judges, you can be the legislators. You have the power to do that if you get together and organize. Tamio was already there when I come into SNCC, and he's, you know, a photographer, working in the darkroom. You know, there were times when Tamio would come out of the darkroom and it would be like he had been on a 3-day drunk, you know, because he would get in the darkroom, he wouldn't come out. It was almost like a caveman, you know, it's like, so, but he was just a fun person, that was the thing. He was purposeful, but he had this joy. He had this sense of joy with him, yeah.
This is a shot of me taken by Tamio in the SNCC office in Atlanta, sometime in the winter of 1964. This was a very formative time for me. And I guess I knew it at the time to some extent, but it's certainly very much the case in hindsight. Well, my friendship with Tamio was almost more like a brother. We were the only Asians in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But we hit it off. I think we shared more than just our ethnicity, though that was not irrelevant under the circumstances. I can only project that his journey was a bit like my journey. It was 1963, and the popular media was just imbued with stories of the civil rights movement. It seemed to me that this was a great thing. I wanted to be a part of this. Tamio grew up in Chatham, the end point of the Underground Railroad from the States. So I can imagine that he had some contacts, at least some historical sense of where he was and its significance to the movement for equal rights. Well, as I reflect on it, I mean, it was a period of high intensity and the stakes were significant. Being so young, we probably were so naive about the real risks that could have happened.
Thoughts of turning back began to cross my mind when the car radio was interrupted by a news bulletin. Earlier that morning, a bomb had exploded in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 young black girls who had been attending Bible classes. I had arrived in the South on Birmingham Sunday. I was determined to satisfy my hunger and was rewarded by the lights of a small restaurant radiating from a side street. Soon, the owner of the restaurant came over to refill my cup and struck up a conversation. "I thank you for coming down here, but I think you should get back in your car and go back home. Tell all your people in Canada that what's happening in the South is all very, very real. The beatings, jailings, and lynching, they be happening now, and they be happening for a long time." I paid my bill, thanked him, but before leaving, I managed to secure one more vital piece of information: the name and location of the A.G. Gaston Motel, the de facto headquarters of the movement. The lobby was filled with movement leaders who had been arriving from all parts of the South and the nation. Most of them were workers of the Student NonViolent Coordinating Committee. The next day, I offered a ride to anyone returning to SNCC headquarters back in Atlanta. After we crossed over into Georgia, I went to pass a slow-moving farm truck, but I wasn't used to a fully loaded Volks and barely managed to tuck in front of the truck before a 16-wheeler came whooshing by in the opposite lane. Killing off the leadership of a major civil rights organization would not have been a good way to begin my career as a freedom fighter.
My name is Leslie Killen. I'm the director of the Center for Documentary Expression and Art. It's a nonprofit organization that is focused on telling the stories of both Utah's and the nation's diverse people, with a focus on social justice and human rights issues. Tamio is not an easy person to describe in just a nutshell, but you know, Tamio was in a lot of ways a self-created individual. When I think back about the way in which he spoke about his life and the risks he took leaving Canada and coming into the American South, I'm struck by the combination of qualities that Tamio had, which was curiosity, a kind of self-deprecating aspect that allowed him to be humble enough to learn in almost all circumstances that he will find himself in, but at the same time having an underlying and perhaps unstated courage to look into things that he felt were important. Tamio came into SNCC in 1963 without a role, without a job. And he initially was, he swept up the office and he drove people around in his VW Bug. He became a photographer because of an activity that somebody asked him to undertake, which was to develop a poster. All of the people apparently in the SNCC office at that time were carrying out activities to desegregate the restaurants. There was nobody in the office, so Tamio undertook to develop this poster, which essentially meant selecting an image and developing text that would go above and below the image. He said he selected an image of a Klansman, big face, kind of growling. And the poster basically said, "The face of Atlanta, help change it." It was out of the creating of that poster and that Danny Line, then the photographer of SNCC, told Tommy, "Hey, this is really great stuff. Why don't you try photographing? And I will even lend you a camera." So that's kind of how Tamio began photographing.
SNCC has projects, all grassroots, mainly concentrated on the vote. And the main grounding for most of those projects is, how do you get Black people registered to vote without getting them killed? How do you get them registered to vote without getting them killed? And so all of these projects in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, Arkansas, they were calling twice a day to let us know what had happened, but also that they were still alive. We would give any information to the communications department. But also, if it's major, like a firebombing or somebody being shot for trying to register to vote, you might send a photographer, say Tamio. He's driving into wherever that is. And then they come back and they use the dark room, which is right there in the national office, developing the films. And then they're giving those photos to the communications department, who's gonna put it in the student voice that month.
So Tamio's role as photographer developed slowly because first he was in the Atlanta darkroom. He began seeing the images that were coming in from the various SNCC photographers. And then one of the first assignments that he took on was when the volunteers from around the country were invited to come down to Mississippi for the summer to be involved in voter registration efforts, to run freedom schools, and to do other related kinds of activity. So here's the orientation for the people coming into Mississippi in the summer of 1964. And here is Tamio.
Freedom Summer, I think, was very much premised on sort of opening up the Deep South. It was a reflection of the political and social reality that of racism, that Black people were essentially invisible, and certainly Black people in the South were invisible.
So part of what happens in '64 is you're bringing these white kids in who have maybe a U.S. congressman who was their father, or a judge, or somebody who is of importance, but also white and Northern, and can get the word out through that Northern media.
Clearly the mass media was not following the lives of poor sharecroppers who were Black or other people regarded as menial labor. But if you had significant numbers of white college students with well-connected parents, that would make a difference. So the training took place in Ohio. I think there were probably about 1,000 students, young people altogether, and they were trained in all aspects of what they were going to encounter. There had to be some awareness, some clear awareness that it was dangerous, that you could risk your lives.
This is another photograph by Tamio. This whole section deals with white pushback. We called it state and local terror because it was, in fact, a form of terrorizing. Another photograph that conveys some of that. A registrar looking physically down and probably suggestive also of man's command and control over the lives of the members of the Black community.
Oh my goodness, it's Tamio. This Freedom School would have become a community center where there would have been a clinic where folks could come and just talk to doctors, find out what was going on. And also it could become a voter registration school, a citizenship school, to go through the application to vote. And what you see here is the cross. That was a burned out cross that the vigilantes, the white vigilantes, Klan or whoever they were, had put in front of this Freedom School to supposedly spread terror. They still thought that violence was going to stop the movement, and of course it never did. And so they burned this cross, and the movement uses it, turns it on its head and uses it and puts freedom on this Klan cross that had been burned previously in front of this Freedom School.
This is the SNCC office. Tamio was inside. Somebody was peeking into the office and trying to figure out what was, being presented here, and you can see it says the student voice. So this is the SNCC paper.
It was really important to have photographers like Tamio and others in the field at that point, because you had to graphically show that it wasn't just the words that are on the paper. You had to show what it really looked like. Who were the local people? It's not just Dr. King, it's local leaders who look like you. They are the people who are making this movement. And part of what we're saying with these photos is, if they can do it, you can do it too.
Tamio fell in love with some of the people and the landscape of the South. So the reason that some photographs of the people, the farmers, the landscape photographs were so meaningful for him is because he felt that they conveyed that love.
I felt at home in the Delta, for its flat landscape was much like the land of my boyhood days. I passed the home of a sharecropper and stopped to take a picture. Peering through my wide-angle lens, the simple structure with its time-worn wood seemed not to be of human design, but rather just another outgrowth of the fertile soil. And I wondered when the human seeds had been planted to sprout the people of the Delta. I had the feeling of lives blending seamlessly with the black soil of the cotton fields, creating a visual and organic unity.
You know, what Tamio always got a sense of was the humanity of Black people. This is one of my favorite photos, not just of Tamio's, but of any. This is a young kid who's saying, "I'm Superman." He has a cloak behind him that's tied here. Tamio's caption, he's saying, "Youthful energy, as with this boy proudly demonstrating his vigor on the streets of Atlanta, was not crushed by segregation's viciousness." What you saw with our photographers, what you saw was people in the fullness. You know, you saw the fullness of Black life in Mississippi.
In retrospect and looking back at it, like, I think the best work I did was of the people, right? Because I wanted, because I loved it. I loved the Delta. It was beautiful to me. And I wanted to pay homage to that life, to their courage, to their wisdom, because, they were the heroes. They fed us, they housed us, they protected us, they went to vote. All these simple little acts could have cost them their jobs, their livelihood, their land, their families, and their own lives. Did you realize the amount of courage that required for them to do that? Because we're outside agitators, in a sense. We can and did, in fact, go back to our own lives. But they're Mississippians. They've got to face, that incredible violence that is Mississippi. I shot, the movement. I shot this great drama. But really, the gist of my work is with the people.
One other thing that may be of importance, Tamio came into the movement troubled about the impact of racism against Japanese Canadians. And that distress and the movement's ability to address racism directly helped Tamio heal. And that healing process, to some degree, is evident in the beauty and the strength he photographs in people's faces.
Being Asian in the Deep South had its distinct advantages. We were a racial anomaly in the black and white world, which allowed us to move freely between the two solitudes. Both sides of the racial divide didn't quite know what to do with us. Except for Brother Ed, I can't remember seeing another Asian face. I had expected to see more Asian Americans in the movement.
I was born in an internment camp or a concentration camp, I mean, depending on which term you might want to use here. Both would be accurate. In Poston, Arizona. I was born in 1943, at a midway point of World War II. We moved from the camp to Wilson, Arkansas, which was a plantation, and then later to Seabrook, New Jersey, where I grew up. But I define myself, as I said, I'm a child of the internment. In spite of itself, it shaped me.
I have a friend who grew up, for example, in rural Mississippi. Now, she knew that there was a Chinese grocer, but that's the only Asian person she saw. And for most folks who would come from Mississippi or Alabama or wherever, I'm not sure they knew what to make of somebody who was not white and not black, but it's not clear what they are, okay? And so when you get somebody like Tamio, first of all, you want to make sure that he's not an agent, because you always were worried that the FBI was sending people in to figure out what you were doing and to stop you. But once you realize he's willing to do whatever it requires, and he's one of us now. It was just, we're basing it on how do they present themselves? What are they willing to do? Are they saying that they're part of this struggle? And Tamio obviously was. So, and Ed was as well. So, they were part of us.
Asian Americans, I think, are a community that is in flux. There are those of us who say, based on our experience, we need to create a society that's better than what we have, that fights for racial equality and social justice. I think Asian Americans can play a major role in shaping that. I'm a child of the internment. That's not irrelevant. It happened to us. It could happen again. So I think we should keep plugging away. I think it's worth a struggle.
Now, it's really ironic, I find it ironic. Like, here I am, product of the 60s, okay? If nothing else, it was an era that brought everything into question, Everything was up for grabs. Every political, social, sexual, truth that you thought existed, well, we're going to check it out and we're going to see if it holds water, okay? Oddly enough, I never used, that critical factor in examining my own history. Like, what did it mean that I had to grow up as an enemy alien? What did it mean that my people were locked up? Where was that at? Have I studied that? Have I analyzed that? Have I brought it toward public consciousness?
The British Columbia coast was my birthplace, my furusato. I was born in the Fraser Valley, the fifth addition to an immigrant clan who, after years of back-breaking labor, had managed to turn a few acres of forest into a prosperous berry farm. Less than a year later, all of that was taken from us. As the year 1941 was coming to an end, my family began to prepare for a special Shogatsu celebration to mark the success of my father's business. The joyful anticipation of the holidays came to an abrupt ending with the fearful news that the Imperial Japanese Navy had attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. 2 months later, my family and I were deported to Hastings Park in Vancouver and then to Tashmi. The Canadian government had declared some 22,000 Nikkei as enemy aliens in their own land. Thriving coastal communities like the fishing village of Steveston and Vancouver's boisterous little Tokyo disappeared overnight as the Nikkei were herded into isolated concentration camps in the interior of BC. When World War II ended, Canada had enough of its Nikkei citizens and made a concerted effort to deport them all to Japan or east of the Rockies. My family managed to escape deportation to Japan, and instead we suffered a lesser banishment to Chatham, Ontario. My last weeks at SNCC proved to be an exciting period of discovery. But as the summer drew to an end, I decided it was time to leave. As I wound my way north, I wondered if I would ever return south. For the last 2 years, I grew and flourished in one of the brightest moments in American history. From the terror and beauty of the Black Belt South, I began to forge a new identity. I went to Japan. The Japanese have an old saying: a tiger may roam 2,000 miles, but will return home without fail. More like a bedraggled tomcat than the proverbial tiger, I wandered into Japan one day from the battlefront of Toronto. It was a good time to fulfill a long-held dream, a pilgrimage to the ancestral land, and a fresh injection of the noble spirit of the samurai. If you can't join 'em, beat 'em. My time in Japan made me realize that, for better or worse, my sense of self had been forged forever in Canada. Japan was the bridge to home, the final crossing in my return to the West Coast, my furusato.
My name is Michiko Sakata. I was born in Nagasaki, left Japan, and I worked at the United Nations in New York. Then I moved to Vancouver, and I was doing a project called Language Aid. Office was in Powell Street. So I was working with the senior citizens in Powell Street, Issei. Then one day, Tamio Wakayama walked into my office. That's why I met Tamio Wakayama. Language Aid was a multilingual social service. I was Japanese language worker, so we had an office on the Powell Street. Amazingly, right away, many Issei people who are still living in the Powell Street started coming asking for help. And I wrote a letter and translated government document, took them to various institutions. And that was the beginning of my connection with the people on the Powell Street, with the Issei. Every Japanese people I met, they always talked about Powell Street. that every interned Japanese Canadian dreamt about going back to Powell Street. To non-Japanese, they might say, oh, it's a horrible place. No, it used to be beautiful. Charlie Kadota told me, Michiko-san, it was beautiful, with the old cake shop and beautiful stores and lined up and bathhouse. And he said, to Japanese Canadian, it was Ginza. It was a dream place. What really surprised me that the story of the internment they start telling me, and also photograph. As a Japanese immigrant coming over, I didn't know anything about Japanese Issei Nisei went through. I was wondering why I haven't read, I haven't been told. So when Tamio walked in, I think we had a long discussion, and I was telling what I was doing, and I was hearing and discovering. I remember very clearly, Tamio said, but I don't think it happens again. So I said to Tamio, well, it might not happen again, but it did happen, and it was just awful experience of why I'm not aware, why people are not telling me. I asked him, what was he doing in Japan? He said he was a photographer. So when he told me he was a photographer, it's really something inside me, it went bang. Here is a man who could tell the story of this man through photograph. So I think I suggested photo exhibit. We started Dream of Riches. We thought the history of Japanese Canadian from the time Manzo Nagano, coming from my town of Nagasaki into Canada, what happened to their dream? And what happened during the war? That was like a lot of secret all these people had, but they wanted to tell. They wanted somebody to hear what they went through.
Randy Enomoto approached me at a softball game. He invited me to join this group of Japanese Canadians doing a photo history of the Japanese in Canada. Well, as much as I knew of the history of the Japanese in Canada, I knew that it actually resembled quite a bit the history of the Japanese in the United States. And I knew a fair amount about that history. And besides, generally, if anyone invites me to do anything, I say yes. So I did. And I met this group of really cool Japanese Canadians and Japanese nationals. And it was so exciting. It was the first time I had any contact with any Japanese outside my family. And so since all my relations with people who looked like me were familial, I immediately felt like they were my family. And they were all kind of involved in this community of Japanese Canadians. And it was a revelation, actually. It was my introduction to the community, and Tamio and I just became really good friends.
We collected a whole bunch of very able, talented people, collected photographs, and wrote a history. We put all this kind of energy. It was incredible. And that passion and love moved the project forward.
Before beginning this project, most of us knew little of our past history. The wartime uprooting of the Nikkei was never taught in our schools. And our parents, perhaps out of an unwarranted sense of shame, never spoke of the dark days of the war years. The greatest reward to those of us who worked on this project would be, in measure, to fulfill this need, to share the experiences of discovery, growth, and pride that is a dream of riches.
I'm Bryce Canberra. I'm a sensei, a visual artist, and a curator. I met Tamio for the first time when I made my first pilgrimage to Vancouver and BC, and that was in the mid-'80s, I think, 1980s. But I also, around that same time, curated an exhibition called Shikataganai, and it was comprised of works by 10 Japanese Canadian artists. It was the first time, really, that we did this group exhibition of works by artists from across the country, and Tamio was one of them. I guess it's pretty well known and understood how the dispersal after the war that sent us all out east played a big part in our assimilation and our loss of identity. For most people, they accepted that, and thankfully, some sensei thought that it was important enough to investigate and explore. It's kind of interesting how in choosing a people to represent and sympathize with, that Tamio chose the Black community rather than initially confronting his own community's history. But that's what a lot of us did, right? And especially artists, are going to, at some point, start looking at who they are and their cultural identities. So that's going to happen.
My name is Paul Wong. I'm an artist, I'm a curator, and you are in my studio in Vancouver, Chinatown. How I met Tamio Wakayama, there's no specific moment. I know that when I was one of the co-founders of Video In, the Media Arts Center, for the first dozen years, we were located on Powell Street, at 261 Powell Street. And I know that Language Aid were down there, and also the development of the Powell Street Festival. So being aligned with that community, obviously, Tamio and I's paths crossed. Almost from the very beginning of my career, there was always a search for authenticity and the voices of others and my own sense of identity. Particularly after 1982, after my first trip with my mother to the motherland, to China, that bewildering journey left a lot of unfulfilled expectations and generated a lot more questions. I started to look for others like me who had those same burning issues about who we are, where we come from, and where we're at now. And I was looking specifically for other artists that were dealing with Pan-Asian, Chinese-Canadian, Japanese-Canadian, Asian diasporic condition, which included artists like Tamio Wakayama. So Yellow Peril Reconsidered really was a series of connected projects and community engagements over a 5 or 6 year period. So it was a big thing to bring together 25 Asian Canadian creators and presenting this as a new force. The notion of the yellow peril was definitely used and popularized by colonials, by political and economic forces that wanted to dominate a certain kind of language, economic and political and military might over a whole color of people. I mean, that's what the European colonials successfully did for thousands and hundreds of years. So we were the yellow peril, and I still am the yellow peril, so watch out. Many artists didn't want to be part of Yellow Peril, reconsidered. They thought that would harm their careers. I was told that I didn't need to be doing this kind of thing, that I'm actually a great artist in my own right. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this thing that's, a marginalized ethnographic demographic? That's the very reason I needed to do it. And the real reason I needed to do it, that there was a lot of this kind of talking around diversity and multiculturalism, policy, position papers, symposiums ad nauseum. I wanted to see the work. I wanted to let the work speak for itself. So it was important to kind of create a project that did that, and to have it tour across the country and have it generate audience critique and community. And it did do that. It opened people's eyes that there was an other, and that the others had something to say of value, quality, and quantity. That it wasn't just hypothetical, that there was the possibilities of new voices making new work for new communities and new audiences, and we proved it.
Oh, rolling and everything.
Lights on.
Huh?
The lights on.
Lights on, rolling, we're doing our thing. What an interview. Okay, this is, what is it, it's December, no, it's January 17th, 6:15. It's more of a conversation than an interview. It's about just as a conversation. How has your attitude, philosophy, use, photography changed, remained the same, and transferred into what you're doing now in this current project? It's a big, broad question.
Yeah, okay. It hasn't changed in the sense that when I picked it up, it became a tool for me. It became an extension of discovery. And it works best for me, always, as an extension of my learning, an extension of my excitement, of my wonderment, of seeing something. In the process of discovery, the South was discovery. It was like grade 1, it was kindergarten. All right. Terribly important, but it's not graduation. Okay? Necessary, but not graduation. I think graduation was in coming to Vancouver and reconnecting with my past and with my community.
The Nikkei Centennial was approaching, and I think it was Take who first came up with the idea of holding a festival in Oppenheimer Park. The idea spread like wildfire. A festival was the perfect means to express our joy in our growing community. But the festival would be much more than just a big party. Choosing the old Powell Street grounds was a political statement, that a new generation of Nikkei, proud and empowered, was reclaiming lost territory and asserting its rightful place.
The first official immigrant to Canada came in 1877. So 1977 would be the centennial year. So they were giving money to the community to do projects. Powell Street Festival was one of the centennial projects. And when we finished the photo exhibit, we all went to work on the festival.
I participated in Powell Street, and everything was exciting happening. Dream of Riches, Powell Street, and Tonari Gumian, and of course everybody participated.
When anything starts, it's really exciting and nerve-wracking because you don't know what's going to happen. You're going to do all this work, put together a program, you're going to set up this park. I mean, that was part of it, was it should be at Oppenheimer Park, where the Asahi played baseball. It was our park, right? The Powell ground. And people reacted to it differently. To the committee, who were not quite so keen as they were for the photo project, thought, these were all older Nisei who had been interned, and they didn't know if it was a good idea for a bunch of Japanese to gather together in one place to be a target, right? And I think they just didn't feel that it was something we as a community should call attention to ourselves. And this would be a public celebration of being Japanese Canadian. Really? Other people might feel that way and maybe nobody would come. And it was wonderful. It turned out to be wonderful, and it turned out to be something that the people who organized it thought should continue. Powell Street Festival started in 1977, and Tamio was the photographer, and he served that position for many years. So we had this huge collection of Powell Street Festival photos, and they were all pretty wonderful. After a few years, he decided, I'd like to do something with it. A book of photographs of Powell Street Festival and interviews with people about the festival and what it meant to them as Japanese Canadians and as part of the community. Tamio asked me to be the interviewer. He knew I could talk to people and ask them questions, and I was interested in what they had to say. And he knew that because I listened to him all the time. This photo became the iconic photo of Taiko. I would have been 40-something. Look at that, so much energy. Holy crikey.
No, I remember being invited by him and Pat Canning to produce this book. So I believe I was involved quite early on in the whole process. If my memory serves me correctly, I didn't want to do a foreword, that I would do an afterword. That the work speak for itself, and an afterword would be the afterthought. You know, I took it very seriously, this idea of doing this 20th anniversary look at the Powell Street Festival community and help assist editing, creating, and making this very important publication. I'm very proud of this book. I'm very, very proud of it, of this project.
Tamio, I met through Powell Street Festival. You know, I can't remember how I met him, but when I was the coordinator in 1995, I kind of met everybody. And as the coordinator, one of your jobs is to hire Tamio as the Powell Street Festival photographer. But when I came to my first Powell Street Festival, I was kind of blown away. It was so big, this big Japanese Canadian community, amazing event that was all, you know, in this one place. And I just remember being really bright and inspiring. The festival has, for me, both Japanese Canadian arts, culture, and history, and being embedded in this Powell Street neighborhood where my dad grew up, where my grandfather was the minister, where my mom's family came and shopped and spent time, and is powerful. It means so much to me to keep the festival going, so it's there for people when they're ready. So when you're looking for community, or you're looking to know more about your own history or your own family history or your own identity, that there's community, there's something there for you to join. And then you have Tamio's photos. He's documented, it exists. We are a community, even if we're small, and that has meaning.
I mean, I think the Powell Street Festival was a very simple ask. It was a coming together, bringing physically the hearts and minds of the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the depossessed, and the interned. And over the years, it has been just that, a place to please come. And to celebrate being together through food, music, dance, voice, redress, to reclaim what was lost, and for a moment, dream what was possible and is possible. That's what a community festival is. It had a purpose and a soul to it. And I think for that reason, it has been able to sustain itself.
In the late 90s, when people were saying, this neighborhood's, you know, down and out, it's too dangerous, there was a lot of calls to move the festival. We were like, move Powell Street Festival out of the neighborhood? Like, we held a bunch of community meetings to say, okay, well, let's talk about it and why. It was really powerful, and I remember it as Rika Morehouse actually saying this, that, you know, our families, our community was on the outside. We were ostracized, we were hated when we lived down here. And we now have a festival that celebrates our community that used to be here, and alongside other people who are now ostracized, hated, stigmatized. We kind of have a moral obligation, but also a responsibility to stand with other folks continuing to face injustice every day, especially Indigenous people. We should stay here and stand with them and be part of that. You know, what can that look like? How does that support for others be part of our own Japanese Canadian legacy? How is that part of who we are? Tamio's story will always be impactful and inspiring if you think about any person, but especially a young person who just decides they want to do something, they want to be part of something and make a difference. I don't know what Tamio's inspiration was to go down south, but the fact that he did it, that to me alone is inspiring, because part of it is just showing up. Maybe something you love to do could be an important part of the thing that needs to happen. You don't even know. So I think that what he did is a great message for anybody.
Tamio. It's an email from Tamio. I'd like to end my narrative by going back to the beginning. I just returned from Raleigh, North Carolina, where SNCC held its 50th anniversary reunion and conference on the campus of Shaw University, I met old friends whom I hadn't seen in over 4 decades. And although our hair was grayer and our bodies a little less agile, we hugged and carried on as if we parted only yesterday. To think that I was once a part of all that is incredulous, humbling, and glorious. One of the last items on the agenda was the introduction of the Children of SNCC veterans. Take note, America. They have snatched the torch from our hands and are organizing the next phase of the struggle in your backyard. They will not be moved, and we shall overcome.
One of the things that the American Civil Rights Movement gave Tamio is it freed him to look back at his life openly and boldly, and probably with a sense of recognition and joy. He went down as Tom, and he returned as Tamio. And that name shift conveys volumes.
When you look at Tamio's remarkable journey picking up a camera in the Deep South to now, it's an incredible story of authenticity and integrity and the longing to come home. He accomplished that, I hope. I think for him, his home was looking through the lens and sharing that. And I know with each time he pointed and shot, he was looking, he was connecting, he was feeling.
You know, what lucky things to have a man like that. Some community to have a photographer recording every year of the community event and people. Japanese community was very lucky to have Tamio.
So it's 2015, and I was giving the grounding of SNCC. What is SNCC? Who were we? So I'm doing this, and as I mentioned the structure of SNCC, I mentioned the photo department, and I said, and by the way, I got word this morning that Tamio Wakayama has passed. And there was this gasp. And I don't know that I realized how many people in that room knew who he was and what he had meant to them. In my mind, it was just, I was bereft, but I don't know that I knew how sorrowful everybody else would be. But, people really, you just don't know how people affect other folks. You know how you're affected, but you don't realize how important he was to other people. And people felt about him. He was one of their brothers. He was one of our brothers.
For some reason, I was going back over old emails, and I came on this email from Tamio. And it turns out I initiated it because I hadn't seen him in a while. So he responded saying, I want you to know that when you and Joyce sang at Charlie Cadota's memorial, I was very moved, and I found it really haunting. And I would like you to sing All the Pretty Little Horses at my memorial. But this email, I kind of kept it, but forgot entirely about singing at his memorial. So when Kokoho Rose was doing a show a couple weekends ago at the fire hall, I decided we should sing All the Pretty Little Horses for Tamio. It's a traditional folk song. Mayu said he must have heard this in the South. Hush-a-bye, don't you cry. Go to sleepy little bee. When you Don't you cry. Go to sleepy little baby. 'Cause when you wake, you'll have cake.
For the first time since the war years, we were back on Powell Street. Not as victims, but as proud victors of a century of racism that had sought our banishment from these lands. After 3 decades of exile, I had found my way home.